Hi, welcome to your pre-reading lecture for our article by Jeanette Peterson about the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. We're going to be talking about the origins of that image and more broadly about the colonial mindset. So as we will see, the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe is a product of the conquest of the Aztec Empire by Spain starting in the 16th century. So what we want to do is get a bit of context about the nature of that invasion and colonization process, and then to talk more broadly about what we mean by the colonial mindset. Because one of the questions we want to keep in mind this week is, can this image of the Virgin of Guadalupe be separated from this colonial history? But first, we need to know a little bit about this colonial history. Okay, so the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, as I mentioned, started in the 16th century in 1519. So we have several years of war in which we see Spanish invaders violently overthrowing the Aztec Empire, as well as invading other areas in the Caribbean and Central America as well. So what we begin to see in 1521 is the establishment of New Spain, so an official colonial government in which the people of Mexico are being ruled by the Spanish monarch, right, back in Spain. And so the image that we're looking at here is actually from a book, the Codex Mendoza, that was created in order to be sent back to the Spanish monarchs. And this is of the founding of Tenochtitlan, which was the capital city of the Aztec Empire, this magnificent city that the Spanish conquerors arrived at and were pretty startled by. They had a bunch of conceived ideas of what these quote-unquote pagan or quote-unquote uncivilized individuals were living like, and then upon arriving at Tenochtitlan, they were shocked. So we're going to take a look at an excerpt from an account of arriving at Tenochtitlan. And we saw all those cities and villages built in the water, and the other great towns on dry land, and that straight and level causeway leading to Mexico, aka Tenochtitlan. We were astounded. These great towns and quays, temples and buildings, rising out of the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision from the tale of Amadis. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether or not it was all a dream. It is not surprising, therefore, that I should write in this vein. It was all so wonderful that I do not know how to describe this first glimpse of things never heard of, seen, or dreamed of before. And we entered the city of Itzapalapa, the site of the palaces in which they lodged us. They were very spacious and well built, of magnificent stone, cedar wood, and the wood of other sweet-smelling trees, with great rooms and courts, which were a wonderful sight, and all covered with awnings of woven cotton. So we're getting a sense of the awe that this individual felt upon arriving at Tenochtitlan, but one of the things that we want to take note of is what he is not mentioning. There's quite a bit of detail about the nature of these towns and cities and what they look like, what things were made out of. We haven't heard anything about the people who were there so far. Okay, so he continues. When we take in a good look at all of this, we went to the orchard and the garden, which was a marvelous place to both see and walk in. I was never tired of noticing the diversity of trees and the various scents given off by each, and the paths choked with roses and other flowers, and the many local fruit trees and rose bushes and the pond of fresh water. There were birds of many breeds and varieties which came to the pond. I say again that I stood looking at it and thought that no land like it would ever be discovered in the whole world. But today, all that I then saw is overthrown and destroyed. Nothing is left standing. Bernal Diaz. So Bernal Diaz was part of this conquering force that entered Tenochtitlan and observed this magnificent city, and as we saw here, observes many of the resources. So the trees, the fruit, the animals, the natural diversity. But again, right, no mention of who is living here, who built this city, who made it so magnificent. So that's really important for us to consider as we begin to talk about the colonial mindset, this absence of any discussion of the people responsible for these wonders that the Spaniards are encountering. We have heard not too much about them yet. Okay, so when we're thinking about defining the colonial mindset, we have this kind of lens that we see coming through in Bernal Diaz's excerpt there. So when we're thinking about the process of conquest and the kind of lens of conquest, you're viewing a country and its people and its resources as something to be exploited. And in particular, what we're thinking about here is that colonialism and colonization is a multi-pronged process. It's social, it's cultural, it's economic, and political. So there's the violence of conquest, of course, but then there's an entire process of creating an entirely new system of power and knowledge. So what we want to consider here is that the standpoint of the colonizer is standing on this ground of a perception of cultural superiority. And this structures the colonizing process. So even though we see Bernal Diaz in awe of this world that he has quote unquote discovered, that does not stop him and his compatriots from tearing it down, as we read. So Diaz does continue in his account of the conquest to characterize the Aztecs of barbarians, even though he spent, a million pages talking about how magnificent their cities and agriculture and everything else was. So this sense of cultural superiority is sometimes coupled with this idea of having a kind of banner of God guiding this process of colonization. So in the case of Spanish colonialism, which is what we're looking at this week, this was framed as being sort of guided by a Christian God, right? That this process of overthrowing the Aztec Empire is ordained by God and it's good, and God's on the side of the Spanish conquerors. So part of this process of kind of taking over Mexico is coming with this sense that God is on the side of the colonizing process. So when we are talking about the colonial mindset, we want to keep in mind the sense of cultural superiority. And so now we want to sort of turn to the other side of the coin. So we're going to read an excerpt from the theorist Ngugi wa Thiago, who is a theorist and a writer, a novelist, and literary theorist who teaches at UC Irvine. And he describes colonization as a cultural bomb. So his perspective as an individual who grew up under British colonial rule is going to give us insight into, so what does it mean to be subject to and a kind of object that is viewed through this colonial lens or this colonial mindset. Okay. The effect of the cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement. It makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. It makes them want to identify with that which is furthest removed from themselves, for instance, with other people's languages rather than their own. It makes them identify with that which is decadent and reactionary, all those forces that would stop their own springs of life. It even plants serious doubts about the moral righteousness of struggle. Possibilities of triumph or victory are seen as remote, ridiculous dreams. The intended results are despair, despondency, and a collective death wish. This is pretty heavy stuff. And two of the things that we want to think about here from the perspective of Thiago is that this idea that you're rewriting and recalibrating one's relationship to one's own cultural history as part of the colonial project. So you are suggesting that your new timeline after colonialism starts with the arrival of your saviors, whether it's the British colonists or the Spanish conquest, right? So this sense that everything that happened before the arrival of this conquering force is a wasteland, right? A wasteland of non-achievement, as he refers to it here. And additionally, this kind of being pried apart from one's own practices, whether it's language, whether it's food practices, whether it's this kind of idea that you deserve greater freedom than a colonial power structure may offer you. The purpose of the cultural bomb, as he calls this process of colonialism, is to kind of annihilate and destroy that as well. To cut off a colonized people from their own history, and to have them identify with the colonizers, right? This kind of really powerful internalization of this idea that the colonizer's culture is somehow superior. Okay, and we'll talk more about this when we get together at our Zoom meeting as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what Aztec religious practices were prior to conquest. So this is a statue of the goddess Coatlicue, and she is a serpent deity, as you can probably tell. And I bring this in to make clear that in Aztec religious practices, there was a strong tradition of venerating female deities. And this is something that we'll see coming up in the reading as far as the origins and power of the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which we'll get to in a moment. So Coatlicue is one of many female deities that were part of the Aztec religious practices prior to conquest. Similarly, we have this figure of the Tonantzin, who is a maternal fertility figure, pictured here, right, holding a couple of children. And so she's also one of these female deities that was a part of pre-colonial, pre-conquest religious practice as well. And so as we discussed, Spanish conquest is characterized by this desire to destroy quote-unquote pagan religions, right, as viewed from the perspective of the colonizer as lesser, right, as backwards, as barbaric. And so conversion played out in a number of different ways. It played out through the violent destruction of the images of other gods, the temples that venerated Aztec deities, which we see pictured here, Spaniards destroying Mexican idols, quote-unquote. And then what we see here is conversion. So we see a priest, and this is a print that's depicting the conversion of a village of women in order to facilitate this growth of a Christian world and a Christian colony in Mexico as well. So conversion becomes a kind of tool or arm of conquest, this changing of religious beliefs and this destruction of past forms of spirituality and past forms of religious practices. And that's not to say that people suddenly stopped worshiping Tonantzin or Coatlicue. Some people went through what is called an incomplete conversion, or a conversion in name only. It's like, yeah, I'll convert, so you will stop bothering me and stop harassing my family, and then continue to keep alive the traditions of venerating goddesses like Coatlicue, for example. Okay. So this is an image that is from, about 40 years after the conquest of Mexico. And what we want to notice about its style is that it's a combination of that carving practice that we saw with the Coatlicue statue, and now we're seeing that kind of carving practice, that approach to sculpture being applied to Christian imagery with the creation of this cross image. And so that kind of hybridity or that duality of this image is something that we're going to read about and discuss as we get into our analysis of the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Sorry about that. So one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that the value and the humanity of the indigenous peoples of Mexico and the Caribbean was not always seen as a kind of person to be converted. So one of the people, De las Casas, who was a priest who was part of this conquering force, right? It's not just a military invasion, but it's a cultural invasion, right? He advocates for the end of enslavement of indigenous people and suggests that they are worthy of conversion as opposed to being treated as individuals to be enslaved or individuals to be slaughtered. So he establishes a kind of advocacy, albeit through, we can advocate for the indigenous folks if they convert to Catholicism, is kind of his frame. So he frames himself as a kind of protector of indigenous peoples in Mexico after having witnessed the violence and horror of these first decades of Spanish conquest and colonial rule. Okay, so this is a quote from De las Casas, who's basically letting the king and queen back in Spain know that essentially, right, they thought they were in the Indies, don't forget that, right? So that in the Indies, it's essentially they've unleashed hell. So set down an accounting of the hell that is the Indies, so that those infinite masses of souls redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ may not die for all eternity without any help for it, but rather to know their Creator and be saved. So for him, these are individuals in need of saving as opposed to individuals that can simply be valued for their labor. Okay, so with all of that in mind, you all are going to read about this image, the image of Virgin of Guadalupe, which traces its origin to 1531. So putting that on our timeline pretty shortly after conquest. Okay, So that's that. I will see you all at our Zoom meeting. Enjoy the reading, get ready for a quiz, and I will talk to you all soon.